They say San Leonardo does not let anyone leave, but it does not stop there. On this island, the walls breathe. Screams that have never been made echo through empty cells. Shadows crawl where no one has walked, and puddles reflect faces that were never born. Every step twists the corridors. Every heartbeat merges with stone, and one desperate hand pressed against the wall is swallowed forever. You will see it, you will feel it, and you will not forget the taste of iron in the air. The first sign was the smell. Thick, coppery, like iron melting into seawater, it seeped through the air before any footsteps could disturb the damp stones, curling into nostrils and clinging to hair and clothing with an insistence that made breathing a labor. On the island of San Leonardo, in 1574, the prison walls, centuries old and blackened with moss and salt, began to breathe, slow and deliberate, inhaling screams that had no origin and exhaling shadows into the fog that rolled across the courtyards like living smoke. The cells, once empty, quivered with the faint outlines of men and women who had never lived, their eyes wide with terror that belonged to someone else, faces etched in a permanent moment of horror, their forms flickering between substance and mist as if the walls themselves were rehearsing the memory of lives that had never been claimed. Damp stone underfoot seemed to pulse with each inhalation of the building, pressing upward into the soles of the feet, into the knees, tugging at the spine, making the act of standing an effort of resistance against the subtle will of the island. The tide lapped against the foundations with a rhythm that was almost deliberate, a heartbeat measured against the memory of each prisoner the prison had ever held or imagined holding, the water carrying with it the scent of iron and wet rope, of rusted locks and brine-soaked timber, filling lungs with a metallic insistence that left a taste of fear and decay. No guard dared approach. The ones tasked with oversight lingered at the edge of the dock, eyes wide, mouths dry, hands trembling against railings slick with sea spray, feeling the pressure of the unseen weight that poured from the stones. Doors that had been closed for decades shifted slightly in their frames, hinges groaning in a sound that suggested thought, while the air between the walls seemed thick with the residue of screams that had never been voiced. In the faint light of dusk, the shadows themselves lengthened beyond the logic of the sun, crawling along the corners of the cells, pooling in places where no one had stepped, and for a moment the entire courtyard seemed to breathe along with the walls, swelling with a rhythm that pressed outward, reaching for the very edges of reality. The water in the moats, usually stagnant and foul, shimmered with a strange clarity, reflecting forms that could not exist, faces twisting in silent gestures of warning and despair, moving just ahead of the eye, disappearing when confronted. Air currents carried a damp, iron-rich scent into every crevice, lifting from the stone like vapor, curling around ankles and wrists, filling ears with the faintest whispers of footsteps and the scrape of chains, neither entirely real nor imagined, leaving the mind unsure whether to tremble or to faint. The ground, slick with moss and condensation, seemed to breathe as well, shifting subtly underfoot, forcing hesitation in every step, and with each inhalation, the prisoner's own heartbeat echoed not in their chest, but against the stone itself, resonating outward, merging with centuries of echoes trapped in the walls. By the hour that should have been midnight, the prison was no longer merely a structure of stone and iron. It had become a living, sentient presence, cataloging terror and memory with patient cruelty, exhaling faint, ghostly forms into the fog, while drawing inward the fear of those who dared tread its damp floors. And yet the island remained silent in outward appearance. The tide continued its ceaseless motion, waves lapping with that deliberate insistence, while unseen figures, if they could be called that, drifted between cell and courtyard, between substance and shadow, leaving behind the faintest trace of movement, the smell of rusted iron, and the undeniable sensation that the walls had already claimed the first screams of those who would never leave. By nightfall, the echoes had grown tangible, filling the prison with a weight that pressed upon every chest, bending bones, twisting sinews, and gnawing at the mind with the persistence of a tide that refused to recede. The walls of San Leonardo, ancient and slick with the dampness of the sea, dripped with condensation that smelled of old blood, coppery and sharp, like the memory of violence distilled into water, seeping down to puddles that had no beginning and no end. Prisoners, many of whom had arrived with confusion and fear that should have been measured by their crimes, now found themselves staring at their reflections in the stagnant pools, and the faces that stared back were not their own. Eyes widened in recognition of expressions they did not know they could make. Lips curled in silent screams that they had never uttered, and each movement of a hand or a foot felt as though it was dictated by some force that had anticipated their intentions and undone them before they could exist. Hands and feet dissolved into shadows, leaving traces on the stones of gestures never performed, of actions imagined and consumed by the memory of the prison itself, each line of shadowed motion inscribed into the damp surface as if the building were recording them, not for justice, but for observation, for cataloging the terror of those it touched. The stones absorbed each heartbeat, each shallow breath, each tremor of muscle, until flesh felt like nothing more than a vessel for memory, and memory itself was no longer anchored in time, but suspended, folded inward upon itself like a tapestry unraveling from its own edge. A prisoner who knelt to touch the puddle found their fingers passing through the reflection of themselves, and then meeting resistance, cold and unyielding, as though the water itself had grown thick with the weight of centuries of fear. The air, dense with moisture and the scent of iron, wrapped around limbs like chains, and with every step across the slick floors, it felt as though the stone beneath was softening, pressing upward into the arch of the foot, tugging at joints and spine, reminding the living that every movement was recorded, catalogued, and judged by an entity older than the mind could grasp. Shadows stretched and contracted across the walls without source, pooling like smoke in corners, forming shapes that suggested both human and inhuman forms, sometimes flickering with faint recognition of faces long dead, sometimes twisting into configurations that were impossible, grotesque, and yet intimate, as though the prison remembered each prisoner's ancestry, each decision, each unmade gesture, and reflected it back into the corridors with deliberate cruelty. The ceiling above seemed to droop and pulse, as if breathing in tandem with the prisoners below, and occasional droplets fell with a sound sharper than the eye could detect, striking the puddles and sending concentric ripples that reflected not the present, but fragments of past and future, reflections of prisoners who had never been incarcerated, of events that had yet to occur, of tortures and anguish recorded by the walls themselves before they had any reason to exist. The chains hanging from the walls, long rusted and silent for decades, began to clink softly, not with the motion of wind or body, but with a pattern of deliberate intention, creating a rhythm that resonated through the stone, vibrating within the bones of those who stood nearby. Even the footsteps that echoed in the corridors were not wholly their own. Each step forward was accompanied by an indistinguishable echo that fell just behind or just ahead, a slight delay or advance that made every prisoner uncertain if they were walking or being led. Eyes darted to doors that had remained closed for years, and they were found to open or close slowly, hinges groaning like the articulation of some ancient ribcage, while behind them cells appeared and disappeared, filled with forms that existed in no timeline the mind could hold. Sometimes a prisoner would glance at a wall, and the stone itself seemed to ripple, like a mirage of skin, stretching and contracting over shapes that were never corporeal, and the smell of wet iron intensified, thickening the air, forcing a taste of copper into mouths, and as they breathed, each inhalation carried with it the faint memory of wounds, the pressure of lifetimes that had never been lived, the unrecorded agony of lives imagined and then erased. The puddles reflected this chaos, turning momentarily to black oil, then back to water, and in each reflection the prisoners saw themselves as they were, as they would be, and as they could never be, faces morphing through fear and confusion with a slow, unbearable patience that seemed to mock the very concept of control. Chains dragged themselves across floors unobserved, dragging shadows that were not tied to any living form, scraping stones with a metallic whisper that penetrated bone, leaving a resonance in the ear that no shouting could erase. The walls seemed to throb in rhythm with the rising and falling of the tide against the foundations, the water sucking back and spilling forward with a precision that suggested awareness, as though the entire prison had become a single organism, inhaling and exhaling terror, cataloging, recording, and feeding upon every sensation of the living trapped within. Occasionally, a prisoner would raise a hand to steady themselves, and find that the air resisted, subtle but undeniable, as if the very atoms conspired to prevent simple motion. Each muscle contraction tugged backward, each gesture countered, leaving the body exhausted before a single action could be completed. The longer they remained, the more the distinction between the living and the shadowed forms around them blurred, until fear was no longer a response but a substance, something tangible, weighing upon the lungs, the ribs, the heart, until the prisoner was less a person and more an echo, a record in the consciousness of the prison, an event noted, compressed, and folded into the walls themselves. A ghost within a living archive that demanded witness. By the hour that should have been dawn, the prisoners were unrecognizable even to themselves. Limbs had lengthened or contracted slightly with each tremor of shadow across the floor. Faces, glimpsed only in the black water, had split and merged, forming mosaics of horror and recognition, leaving each observer with a sense of vertigo and nausea, as though their own identities had been overwritten with the memory of everyone who had ever passed through San Leonardo. And yet the air remained still, the stones silent in appearance, the walls motionless, as if the prison was satisfied to record in secret, waiting for the next hour, the next breath, the next heartbeat to be absorbed, weighed, and returned as a reflection, until the living could no longer discern where they ended and the prison began, until each cry, each shiver, each tremor of flesh became part of the slow, unyielding architecture of terror that had existed before time and would endure long after the last stone had claimed the last scream. In the moonlight, the courtyard of San Leonardo shimmered with a subtle, impossible motion, as if the stones themselves had grown aware of their own existence. Chains rattled of their own accord, scraping against the cobblestones in a rhythm that was neither regular nor random, dragging invisible bodies through the mist that clung to the ground like a living blanket. The gates shifted with deliberate slowness, hinges creaking as if the prison exhaled each hour with a patient awareness, and the air trapped inside carried the metallic tang of iron, the sweetness of rust, the faint bitterness of decay that had seeped into the walls centuries before. Occasionally, a scream would pierce the fog only to stop abruptly, as if the stone itself had swallowed the sound whole, leaving a silence that throbbed against the eardrums, pressing inward, insinuating itself into the chest and lungs of anyone who dared linger. Prisoners awoke from sleep to find their cell doors lined with faint, indistinct imprints, the shapes of hands, backs, faces, none of which they could recall seeing, and yet all of which pressed into the memory as if urging recognition. Each corridor seemed to stretch and contract while they moved, tilting perceptibly, subtly enough to disorient the mind, so that a step forward became a negotiation with space itself, a trial of balance against the subtle, patient will of the prison. Time did not pass in the traditional sense. It lingered, compressed and suspended in the damp corridors, pressing forward and backward simultaneously, and prisoners felt their own moments of awareness fragmenting, splitting across hours and minutes that refused linearity, so that each breath could belong to a now that had not yet arrived, or to a past that had never truly been. The walls pulsed faintly, a low, rhythmic vibration that resonated through the stone into the bones, as if the prison was a heart beating beneath their feet, slow and deliberate, recording not only sound but motion, thought, the rising of fear, the tremor of muscle, and the weight of memory. Shadows shifted in patterns that defied logic, slipping across walls and floors in imitation of gestures never performed, forming tableaus of impossible horror that reenacted themselves in faint, recurring sequences. Prisoners found themselves standing where they had never been, walking corridors that should have ended abruptly, and glimpsing doors that had no place on the architecture of the building. The puddles in the courtyard reflected not their own forms, but impossible duplicates, bodies that twisted in pain, or crouched in fear, or stretched into positions that mocked natural anatomy, faces frozen mid-scream or mid-plea, mouths moving in silent language that passed comprehension. Occasionally, water rose slightly against gravity and ran up walls in thin streams, carrying with it the faint, coppery smell of blood and salt, dripping in patterns that resembled letters and sigils, forming symbols that might have been warnings or invitations, but never resolved into meaning, leaving the mind to twist in frustration. The faint scraping of chains accompanied the subtle shifts in the floor, as if the prison itself was rehearsing some long-forgotten ritual, dragging the echoes of bodies that had been, or never existed, across the stones in loops that repeated without end. Those who attempted to sleep found themselves caught in a rhythm of breaths and heartbeats that did not belong to them, inhalations measured against some invisible standard, each exhalation punctuated by a faint echo that trembled at the edge of hearing, like the residue of screams absorbed from centuries past. Windows and doorways appeared and vanished when unobserved. Hallways branched into impossible corridors, ceilings dipped and rose without warning, and prisoners learned to distrust not only the walls and floors, but the very air, which pressed against the skin with a subtle insistence, carrying the metallic tang of memory and the weight of anticipation. At times, the courtyard seemed to expand, the stones drawing apart to create spaces that could not exist, only to collapse again, leaving bodies trapped in narrow passages that had only moments before appeared wide and open. The fog itself carried sound in strange, unpredictable ways. A scream that began in one corridor would appear to originate elsewhere, or refract into a series of high-pitched wails, each layered upon the other, until the mind could not distinguish the source or number of voices, only the insistence of terror. Prisoners found themselves unable to determine if they were moving forward or backward, and the puddles reflected not the direction of steps, but a distorted history of their own attempts at movement, multiplied and reversed until each reflection became an abstract record of futility. Footfalls left no mark, yet stones bore the impression of bodies that had never walked them. Chains clattered, yet no link could be traced to a hand or a body. Shadows occasionally detached from the walls entirely, hovering for a moment in the corner of vision before flickering away into nothing, leaving an aftertaste of dread that lingered in the mouth and throat. The tides surrounding the island seemed to respond to this accumulation of pressure, lapping against the foundations with a cadence that matched the pulse of the prison itself, and each wave carried a faint resonance, a vibration that sank into the bones, as if the waters were extensions of the walls, participating in the absorption of terror and the recording of fear. By the hour that should have been midnight, prisoners could no longer distinguish where they ended and the prison began. Limbs, shadows, reflections, and memories coalesced into an endless loop of perception and dread, each movement traced by forms that never existed, each glance answered by images that had never been formed. The courtyard, silent in its external appearance, was alive within, a living archive of screams and shapes, patiently, inevitably cataloging every heartbeat, every trembling breath, every tiny act of awareness, until the prisoners themselves became indistinguishable from the shadows, their identities folded into the stone, leaving only the lingering weight of presence, a record of consciousness absorbed into the walls, into the water, into the very air, so that when the moonlight waned, only the memory of horror remained, pressing outward to touch the edges of reality itself. The prisoners began to notice the walls themselves shifting, the stones softening under the weight of centuries, bending in ways that were neither subtle nor abrupt, but deliberate, as if the prison had grown impatient with the constraints of human perception. Narrow corridors stretched into impossible angles, turning corners that should have ended abruptly into endless tunnels that coiled back upon themselves, ceilings bowed and twisted overhead, groaning faintly like the articulation of some massive, unseen body, while shadows lengthened unnaturally, fed by the fear and hesitation of those who had never walked these halls before. Footsteps left no echo in the stone, yet the sound of running filled every corridor, a distant, inhuman rhythm that carried with it the faint scent of burnt leather, rusted iron, and something darker, more subtle, like the memory of blood dried and forgotten. Figures crouched in corners flickered like smoke, corporeal and yet not, reenacting final moments of lives no one could recall, each repetition layered atop the last, until the present seemed to buckle beneath the weight of centuries of torment, collapsing in on itself until walls, floor, and ceiling were no longer distinguishable from one another. The living and the dead became impossible to tell apart, their forms overlapping in the dim, damp light, faces frozen in expressions that had never belonged to them, mouths opening in silent pleas or screams that were swallowed before sound could form. The walls themselves seemed to breathe in response to each pulse of terror, exhaling a thick, metallic smell that clung to skin and clothing, curling into nostrils with a persistence that made each breath feel like an intrusion into some deliberate process the stones carried out without haste. The corridors twisted, coiled, and doubled back in ways that made each step uncertain, every turn a gamble with memory, so that prisoners who thought they knew the way became hopelessly lost in halls that existed and did not exist, forming and unforming around the weight of centuries of suffering. Occasionally, a shadow would detach from its corner, hovering in the corridor for a moment before dissipating into mist, leaving a trace of cold and iron on the skin, the unmistakable sensation that something had passed through them without ever touching, recording without consent. The echoes of unseen feet running, dragging chains, and soft scuffing of bare soles reverberated in impossible directions, sometimes behind the prisoner, sometimes above, sometimes beneath the floor, carrying with them whispers that formed no language known to tongue or mind, half-sentences that promised revelation or doom, neither entirely threatening nor comforting, but insistent in their incomprehensibility. Walls pulsed faintly, contracting and expanding in a rhythm that seemed to match the pulse of the prisoners themselves, as if the building had grown sentient over decades, collecting each tremor of fear, each heartbeat, cataloging them like leaves pressed in a book, each preserved for some purpose that only it understood. Puddles collected in the uneven stone, reflecting impossible forms, mirroring corridors that should not exist and faces that belonged to no one alive. The water thickened at times, darkening to black oil, then receding, carrying the faint copper scent of blood, the acrid tang of smoke, and the subtle bitterness of rust, pooling around ankles and seeping into flesh, leaving a lingering impression that was both fear and knowledge. Occasionally, the prisoners would catch sight of themselves, or what seemed to be themselves, standing in a corner that had no view of them, limbs bent in impossible angles, eyes wide with terror that had yet to be experienced, mouths moving in words they could never hear. Ceilings would sag and rise with a slow inevitability, forming vaults that collapsed into themselves, sending the prisoner's gaze spinning in an effort to anchor in reality, while floor stones shifted, tilting, bowing, contracting beneath bare feet, so that every movement required careful negotiation, and yet every gesture was catalogued by the walls in a language of pressure, echo, shadow, and reflection. The air carried subtle vibrations, so faint that only those who had succumbed to despair could perceive them, a rhythm of existence measured not by seconds, but by the accumulation of fear, despair, and anticipation, pressing on chest, back, and shoulders, tugging at muscles and sinew as though to ensure that the prisoners were fully incorporated into the memory of the place. Even the chains, long rusted and unmoving for decades, clattered without cause, the sound following forms that were sometimes not there, dragging across floors, along walls, leaving impressions that the mind tried to reconcile but could not, a proof of bodies that existed only in the archive of the building. In the courtyard, where the moonlight fell thick and damp, the puddles reflected corridors leading nowhere, arches that twisted upward into the sky before folding back upon themselves, and faces, sometimes one, sometimes many, that blinked in unison, watched, and then vanished, leaving only the lingering metallic taste of iron in the mouth and the memory of their gaze etched into the skull. By the hour that should have been midnight, the prisoners no longer distinguished between walls, shadows, water, and themselves. Limbs and faces merged, perceptions folded inward, and fear became a substance that could be inhaled, tasted, and felt in every nerve ending. The walls whispered secrets in languages no tongue could form, half memories of lives that had never existed, instructions or confessions they could not understand, and yet comprehended in the marrow and sinew, pressing into awareness with patient insistence, until the living were indistinguishable from the echoes and the reflections, trapped in a continuous loop of observation, terror, and slow, deliberate transformation. The prison itself was patient. It had been patient for centuries, collecting, weighing, recording, and folding each prisoner into the architecture of suffering, until nothing remained outside its observation. And by the moon's final hour, the prisoners were not inside San Leonardo. They were part of it. Each heartbeat, each breath, each shadowed movement folded into the stone, into the water, into the air, leaving only the sensation of eternity and inevitability pressing outward against every nerve. By the third week, the prison had become a mirror of itself, a place where repetition and deviation wove together in a pattern that defied reason. Every corridor repeated endlessly, stretching and folding back upon itself with a subtle, deliberate difference, as if memory refused to stabilize, as if the very stones of San Leonardo had grown conscious and demanded that nothing remain the same for long. Prisoners found themselves retracing steps they could not recall taking, only to discover that each path had shifted, walls bending inward, ceilings dipping and rising with a rhythm that pressed upon their awareness. Hair darkened and paled in the same hour, skin tightening and slackening like the elastic of a glove pulled too many times, fingers elongating and shrinking, eyes widening and closing in a sequence that could not be measured, until no one could identify the beginning or end of their own lives. Limbs became uncertain, hands disappearing into the shadow of their own gestures, feet tracing steps that no longer belonged to the stone beneath them, and yet the steps were recorded, catalogued in the subtle vibration of the prison, in the walls, the floors, and the air itself. The stone absorbed not only the body but the essence of consciousness, a patient collection of awareness pressed into grooves and crevices, each tremor of thought, each heartbeat, each inhalation and exhalation etched invisibly into the architecture of suffering. A man could reach for the gate, grasping the cold iron of its bars, only to feel his hand stretch beyond its tangible form, passing through eternity, touching the walls he would never escape, finding the continuity of stone extended into something beyond flesh, beyond time. The puddles along the floors reflected impossible sequences, faces that aged and returned to infancy in moments, bodies folding in upon themselves and unfolding into new shapes, eyes blinking in anticipation of horrors that had yet to arrive, mouths forming words that could never be spoken, and every reflection echoed in the mind, as if the prisoner were not alone, but multiplied infinitely. Beneath the waves that licked the foundation, the tide seemed to carry memory itself, water rising and falling against expectation, whispering names and half-phrases, resonating with the coppery tang of old blood, the faint sweetness of rust, and the acrid scent of smoke that had long since left the air, harmonizing with voices long dead, those yet unborn, and those trapped in the fragile instant between. Each wave carried fragments of lives and deaths, a chorus of impossible recollections that pressed upon consciousness with a weight that could not be resisted. The shadows along the walls became fluid, separating from their sources, twisting and coiling in geometries that mocked natural laws, sliding beneath doors, curling over ceilings, and pooling into the corners of cells, forming silent shapes that could not be named, yet pressed recognition into the prisoners' minds, leaving a lingering sense of guilt, fear, and awe. Light from the moon, when it penetrated through the fog and barred windows, fractured upon puddles, reflecting halls that were not there, ceilings that should not exist, and figures who moved independently of their living counterparts, each repetition diverging, as if the prison were performing a calculation whose result no human could comprehend. Some prisoners found themselves standing in spaces they knew were familiar, only to see their own forms walking beside them, delayed by moments unmeasured, mirroring every tremor of muscle, every flicker of emotion, but not perfectly, always subtly different, always watching, judging, recording. The soundscape of San Leonardo grew layered and intricate. Chains dragging over stone where no one walked, whispers spiraling upward only to dissolve into the stagnant air, distant footfalls that multiplied and contracted, carrying the smell of burned leather, rust, and the faint, uncanny tang of decay that had never reached mortality but lingered anyway, pressing against the skin and into the mind. Prisoners could feel themselves fragmenting, consciousness separating into overlapping sequences, each identity folding into others, creating a palimpsest of terror that the walls absorbed and returned in subtle vibrations, like a heartbeat measured against eternity. Occasionally, a scream would arise, originating from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing through corridors that looped impossibly, reverberating in puddles and stones, then fading into silence, leaving a residue of expectation that shivered along the spine and into every nerve ending. Hands passed through walls, brushing against stone that seemed warm, as though alive, walls pulsing with a rhythm that synchronized imperfectly with the pulse of flesh, dragging each prisoner into a state where the body obeyed and disobeyed simultaneously. The air itself became an instrument of the prison's will, thickening, vibrating, pressing into the lungs, carrying with it the metallic tang of memory, the faint sweetness of despair, the acrid taste of inevitability. Time ceased to be measurable. Minutes expanded into centuries, centuries folded into seconds, and prisoners could no longer tell whether they were moving forward, backward, or in circles that did not exist. Every action was observed, recorded, mirrored, and reconfigured, until movement itself became a rehearsal, a repetition of gestures that would never yield freedom. The living and the echoes intertwined completely, limbs and shadows forming grotesque mosaics of memory, faces overlapping, eyes staring in contradictory directions, voices whispering names that belonged to no one, and yet each name pressed recognition into the soul. By the hour that should have been the last of night, the prisoners felt themselves absorbed fully into the architecture, not crushed, not destroyed, but folded into the logic of the prison, becoming part of its memory, part of its calculation, part of the living archive that recorded every terror, every hesitation, every heartbeat that had ever occurred within its walls. And the tide, patient and eternal, lapped against the foundation once more, carrying the choir of the dead, the unborn, and the trapped, harmonizing with the pulse of stone and air, until San Leonardo itself seemed to hum with awareness, a slow, deliberate consciousness that had been waiting for centuries to collect and claim every fragment of life within reach. When dawn arrived, it did not break. The sun hovered in a sky that shimmered with unnatural light, a pale, sickly glow that fell upon corridors and cells that had never existed, upon doors that opened into ceilings and floors that stretched impossibly into nothing. Prisoners moved through spaces that looped upon themselves, each turn giving birth to new hallways, each shadow birthing new shapes that mirrored the fears they had not yet lived, the terrors they would never survive. Faces flickered in puddles on the stone floor, and those reflections were never fully human. Eyes rolled backward, mouths moved in silent syllables, limbs bent and twisted in ways that made recognition impossible. Some reached toward their own images, hands trembling, only to touch the cold, unyielding mirror of themselves transformed into shadow, or perhaps the reflection had become the truth, and they were merely fragments of stone pretending to remember life. The air was thick with copper and decay, the metallic tang of blood that had never flowed mingling with the acrid scent of burnt leather and smoke long extinguished, pressing into nostrils and filling every breath with the taste of inevitability. The walls pulsed faintly, contracting and expanding with a slow, deliberate rhythm, breathing out centuries of memory and fear, pulling each prisoner inward into themselves and outward into the stone until no distinction remained. Doors opened into walls, corridors doubled back into themselves, ceilings hung low and then stretched upward into impossible heights, and prisoners could feel their bodies lengthen and compress in time with the architecture, bones bending with a patience the living could not match, muscles slackening and tensing without consent, until movement itself was both impossible and inevitable. Screams that had once been swallowed by the walls returned in waves, cascading over stone, over iron bars, over the stagnant pools, over the waters that lapped against the foundations, spilling into the air above the island, carried on a wind that seemed to exist only to transport terror, echoing across cities that had never seen the island, across lands that had never existed, across time itself. Some prisoners found themselves pressing their hands against the cold stone, feeling the heartbeat of the building beneath their palms, a pulse that was not their own, yet they could not resist the rhythm, could not separate themselves from its insistence. Fingers pressed into walls and disappeared, swallowed by the architecture as if the stone were hungry, and when the hand was gone, the sensation remained, a phantom ache that spoke of permanence and loss. Eyes turned to the windows that had no view, reflecting courtyards that could not exist, skies that shimmered with impossible stars, and shadows of forms that had never walked these halls moved independently, hovering, stretching, folding in and out of themselves, leaving impressions upon the stone that would last for centuries. The tide lapped insistently against the foundations, carrying a strange resonance of voices long dead, voices never yet born, voices trapped in the echo of a prison that had always been, yet was never meant to exist. Water pooled in puddles along the floors and reflected corridors that twisted impossibly into the sky, and when prisoners gazed into them, they saw not only themselves, but every self they had ever been and would never become, every choice folded and reversed, every scream anticipated and yet unmade. And in the courtyard, the cells themselves moved imperceptibly, stretching and contracting with each prisoner as heartbeat, walls leaning inward as if to examine the contents within, ceilings pressing down like the lid of a coffin, floors tilting with a deliberate, almost tender malice. One prisoner, trembling, pressed a hand against a wall, as though in defiance, and the stone seemed to respond, swallowing the hand into itself, finger by finger, wrist by wrist, until the arm disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but a shiver that ran through the body, a reminder that resistance was meaningless. The body became less than a body, consciousness less than consciousness. The prisoners folded into the memory of the prison until they were indistinguishable from its stones, its shadows, its pools, its air. The sun above hung still, casting pale, impossible light that illuminated every impossible detail. Corridors stacked atop one another, walls that shifted imperceptibly, doors that led to nowhere, reflections that multiplied endlessly, shadows that moved independently, puddles that contained entire histories, and a courtyard that breathed with the pulse of eternity. Beyond the island, the world went on unaware, but the echoes of San Leonardo reached across the waves, over cities and forests, into streets where no one could see, carrying a fragment of horror that could not be named, that could not be grasped, yet pressed against the consciousness of anyone sensitive enough to feel it. And in that courtyard, among the silent, twisting cells, one hand, living, trembling, desperate, pressed against the stone, reaching for escape, reaching for a breath, for a future that had been promised, only to be drawn fully into the wall, swallowed into the memory of the building forever. The iron scent of blood, the acrid tang of rust, the faint sweetness of decay lingered in the air, a reminder that San Leonardo would remember all, forgive nothing, and that those who survived beyond its walls, or thought they did, would never truly know what had been lost, what had been consumed, what had been folded into the endless, patient consciousness of a prison that had never been meant to release. Time ceased, space ceased, body ceased, leaving only the enduring, inescapable archive of terror, a monument to suffering and inevitability, preserved in stone, in water, in air, in memory, and in the echoes of screams that would never end.